I came to visit my son, and he invited me to have a beer at a local pub. When my son left, the bartender grabbed my arm and told me a shocking truth. I had to climb out of the pub through the toilet window and started following him. Suddenly, exactly 5 minutes later. Just listen to what happened. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The trunk slammed shut with a metallic thud that echoed through the quiet Seattle street. My old Ford had served me well on the 6-hour drive from Portland, but my back reminded me of every pothole between there and here. I pulled my leather suitcase from the trunk, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. "Dad!" Lance's voice carried false brightness across his small front yard. He bounded down the porch steps with arms spread wide, but something felt wrong. His smile stretched too tight across his face, like plastic wrap over yesterday's leftovers. I studied my son as he approached, 35 years old, and still that nervous energy that made him pace during phone calls. But this was different. His hands trembled as he reached for my bag. "Here, let me get that," he said, fumbling with the handle. The suitcase nearly slipped from his grip. "I've got it." I kept hold of my bag, watching his eyes dart away from mine. "You okay, son?" "Perfect. Just really glad you're here." He wiped his palms on his jeans. "Come on, Lucinda's making that lasagna you love." The smell of garlic and herbs drifted from the open windows of his Belltown townhouse. Through the glass, I caught a glimpse of my daughter-in-law bustling around the kitchen, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon light. At least someone in this family seemed genuinely happy about my visit. Lance grabbed my elbow as we walked toward the house, his grip tighter than necessary. "Dad, we need to talk. Seriously." I stopped walking. "Let's talk now." "No, no." He shook his head rapidly, that fake smile returning. "First get settled. Rest after the drive. We'll have dinner, catch up properly. Then we'll sit down and—" His voice trailed off, but his meaning hung in the air between us like smoke. Whatever conversation he had planned, it wasn't going to be pleasant. I'd learned to read people in 40 years of running an auto parts business, and Lance was broadcasting anxiety like a radio tower. "Lance?" Lucinda appeared in the doorway, flour dusting her apron. "Is everything all right out there?" "Everything's great," he called back, his voice pitched higher than normal. "Dad just arrived." She waved at me with genuine warmth. "Orval, how was the drive? You must be exhausted." I returned her wave, but kept watching Lance from the corner of my eye. He was fidgeting with his car keys, jangling them in a nervous rhythm that set my teeth on edge. In all my years, I'd never seen him this wound up. "The drive was fine," I called to Lucinda, then lowered my voice for Lance. "Son, whatever's eating at you, we can handle it. We're family." For a moment, his mask slipped. I saw something desperate flash across his face before he rebuilt that brittle smile. "I know, Dad. I know we can figure this out. That's why—" He caught himself, glanced toward the house where Lucinda waited. "That's why I'm so glad you came." "Figure what out?" The question burned in my throat, but Lance was already moving toward the front door, practically bouncing with nervous energy. Whatever he needed to tell me, it was big enough to make a grown man shake like a leaf in a thunderstorm. I followed him up the porch steps, my suitcase heavy in my hand and a growing unease heavy in my chest. The Seattle evening air carried the scent of rain and something else I couldn't quite identify, something that felt like trouble brewing. The guest bedroom felt smaller than I remembered from my last visit 2 years ago. I methodically hung my shirts in the narrow closet, smoothing each one against the rod with practiced efficiency. 40 years of living alone after Martha passed had taught me the value of keeping things organized, keeping busy when my mind wanted to wander into dark territory. Lance's behavior downstairs gnawed at me like a splinter under the skin. I pulled my blood pressure medication from my toiletry kit, shaking 2 pills into my palm. The doctor had warned me about stress, but at 65, stress seemed to find me whether I invited it or not. Through the window, I caught movement in the backyard. Lance stood near his small garden, a cigarette dangling from his lips. When had he started smoking? Lucinda hated cigarettes, always complained about the smell when we passed smokers on the street. Yet there he was, taking long, desperate drags, like a man trying to calm his nerves. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, watching my son pace back and forth across the small patch of grass. His free hand kept running through his hair, messing up the careful styling he'd maintained since college. The cigarette glowed orange in the gathering dusk. The phone call from last month echoed in my memory. Lance had been vague about financial difficulties, mentioned something about unexpected expenses and tough times. I'd offered to help then, like any father would, but he'd brushed off my concerns, said everything was under control. This didn't look controlled. This looked like a man drowning. I sat heavily on the guest bed, feeling the spring's protest under my weight. The house creaked around me, filled with the sounds of domestic life. Lucinda hummed in the kitchen below, pots clattering as she prepared dinner. Somewhere, a television murmured about weekend weather forecasts and traffic updates. But underneath it all, I sensed something wrong. Call it intuition, call it paternal instinct, but Lance's behavior triggered every alarm bell I'd developed over decades of dealing with desperate customers who couldn't pay their bills. The desperate ones always had the same tells: the nervous laughter, the inability to make eye contact, the way they'd fidget with whatever was in their hands, the way they'd build up to asking for help, circling around the real problem like vultures around roadkill. Rain began pattering against the window, Seattle's eternal soundtrack. I watched Lance stub out his cigarette and immediately light another one. His movements were jerky, agitated. He kept glancing up at the house, then away, as if he couldn't decide whether to run inside or keep running altogether. What kind of financial trouble required this level of anxiety? Job loss? Credit card debt? Something worse? I unpacked my spare pants, trying to ignore the growing knot in my stomach. Lance had always been impulsive, prone to grand schemes that never quite worked out. But he'd never been dishonest with me, never hidden things that mattered, until now. The medication kicked in, easing the tightness in my chest slightly, but it couldn't touch the worry that was settling into my bones like arthritis. Whatever Lance needed to discuss, it was serious enough to make him chain smoke in his own backyard, while his wife cooked dinner for his visiting father. I folded my empty suitcase and tucked it under the bed, movements automatic, while my mind churned through possibilities. None of them were good. "Orval!" Lucinda's voice carried up the stairs, bright and welcoming. "Dinner's ready!" I took one last look out the window. Lance was stubbing out his second cigarette, steeling himself for whatever came next. His shoulders were set in a way I recognized from childhood, right before he'd confessed to breaking something or getting in trouble at school. But this felt bigger than broken windows or schoolyard fights. This felt like the kind of trouble that changed everything. The dining room smelled like heaven. Lucinda had outdone herself with the lasagna, layers of cheese and meat sauce bubbling under a perfectly golden crust. She'd even lit candles, their warm glow dancing across the mahogany table that had been her grandmother's. "This looks incredible," I said, settling into my chair. The normalcy felt forced, like we were all actors playing parts in a family dinner commercial. Lance poured wine with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Red drops splattered onto the white tablecloth, and he cursed under his breath while dabbing at the stains with his napkin. "Rough day at work?" I asked, watching him struggle with the bottle. "Something like that." He managed to fill 3 glasses without further disaster. "How's the parts business? Still keeping those old cars running?" We fell into safe territory: my shop, the weather, Lucinda's job at the library. She chatted about a new book club program while serving generous squares of lasagna. Lance picked at his food, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces without actually eating much. The rain had intensified outside, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. I was halfway through my serving when Lance suddenly set down his fork with a sharp clink. "Dad," his voice cut through Lucinda's story about difficult patrons. "We need to have that talk now." Lucinda's smile faltered. She looked between us with growing concern. "Lance, maybe after dinner," she started. "No, now." He turned to face me fully, his face pale in the candlelight. "Dad, I need money. A lot of money." I set my own fork down slowly. "How much is a lot?" "More than $1 million. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at my son, searching his face for any sign this was some kind of joke. But his expression was dead serious, almost desperate. "Are you out of your mind?" "I've done the calculations," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Your business is worth about $600,000, maybe more to the right buyer. The house in Portland should bring another 400, plus your savings, your retirement accounts. You want me to sell everything? My voice came out strangled. Lose everything I've worked for because of your mistakes? Lucinda's face had gone white. She was staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. They're not just mistakes, Dad. This is serious. Life and death, serious. Lance leaned forward, his eyes wild. I borrowed money from the wrong people, and now they want it back with interest. Lots of interest. Who did you borrow from? That doesn't matter. What matters is that I need over $1 million, and I need it fast. You're the only person who can help me. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I'm not destroying my life to fix yours. Dad, please, his voice cracked. You don't understand what these people will do if I don't pay them back? Then you should have thought about that before you borrowed their money. Lucinda finally found her voice. Lance, what are you talking about? What people? How much did you borrow? He ignored her, keeping his eyes locked on mine. I'm your son, your only son. Doesn't that mean something? It means everything, I said quietly, but it doesn't mean I'm going to sacrifice 4 decades of work to bail you out of whatever mess you've created. The candles flickered in the sudden silence. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault on the windows, matching the storm that had just broken over our family dinner table. I can lend you $200,000, I said finally. Cash, no questions asked, but that's my limit. Lance's face twisted with something between rage and disbelief. 200,000? Dad, that's not even close to... It's what I can do without destroying everything I've built. You never supported me. Lance's fist slammed down on the table with explosive force. Dishes rattled, wine glasses jumped, and a stream of red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. When I needed you most, you were always too busy with your precious business. I stood up slowly, crossing my arms over my chest. 40 years of dealing with desperate customers had taught me to recognize manipulation when I saw it. That's not true, and you know it. Isn't it? His voice pitched higher, more desperate. High school football. You missed half my games because of inventory deliveries. College graduation, you left early for some emergency parts order. And now, when I'm facing real danger, you offer me scraps. Lucinda had started crying quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched her husband transform into someone she didn't recognize. Her hands shook as she reached for her napkin. I can lend you $200,000, I repeated, keeping my voice level despite the storm raging across the table. Cash, no questions asked. Earn the rest yourself. Earn it, Lance laughed, a bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Dad, I don't have time to earn it. These people don't give extensions or payment plans. They break bones first, ask questions later. His chair scraped backward as he jumped to his feet, pacing behind the table like a caged animal. The candlelight cast wild shadows across his face, making him look almost monstrous. You have no idea what it's like, he continued, his voice breaking. Living with this weight, knowing that any day they might decide I've had enough time. 200,000 is nothing to them. It's an insult. Then maybe you shouldn't have borrowed from them in the first place. My calm response only seemed to fuel his rage. He grabbed his wine glass, and for a moment I thought he might throw it. Instead, he drained it in one gulp, red drops staining his lips. Easy words from someone who never took a real risk in his life, he spat. You played it safe, sold car parts to the same customers for decades. Never dreamed big, never reached for anything beyond your little corner of Portland. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. I'd played it safe after Martha died, focused on building something stable and reliable. But that stability was what allowed me to offer him anything at all. Those safe choices put food on your table and paid for your college, I reminded him. They built the business that's giving you this chance. Lucinda's quiet sobbing grew louder. She pushed back from the table, hugging herself as if trying to hold her world together. Please, she whispered. Both of you, please stop. But Lance was beyond hearing her. He leaned across the table, his face inches from mine. You know what Mom would say if she were here? She'd tell you to help your son. She'd tell you that family comes before business. The mention of Martha hit me like a physical blow, but I didn't let it show. Your mother would also tell you to take responsibility for your mistakes instead of blaming everyone else. My mistakes? His voice rose to almost a shout. What about your mistakes, Dad? What about all the times you chose work over family? Maybe if you'd been there more, I wouldn't have. Wouldn't have what? Made the choice to borrow money from criminals? That's your decision, Lance. Own it. Lucinda's chair scraped against the hardwood as she stood abruptly, her tear-stained face flushed with determination. Enough! Her voice cut through our argument like a blade. Both of you, just stop it right now. The authority in her tone surprised us both. Lance's mouth closed mid-sentence, and I found myself stepping back instinctively. She wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara that made her look older, wearier. This isn't solving anything, she continued, her voice shaking but resolute. You're both exhausted, angry, and saying things you don't mean. Everyone needs to go rest and calm down. Lance opened his mouth to protest, but she held up her hand. No arguments. Dad's had a long drive. You've been stressed for weeks. And She took a shaky breath. I need some time to process all of this. I looked at my daughter-in-law, really looked at her, and saw the toll this evening had taken. Dark circles under her eyes, tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled as she spoke. Whatever problems Lance had brought to our family, she'd been carrying the weight of them too. Lucinda's right, I said quietly. I'm sorry for the shouting, Lucy. This isn't what I wanted for tonight. She managed a weak smile. I know. I know you both love each other, even when you're fighting like this. Lance ran his hands through his hair, messing up the careful styling from earlier. For a moment, he looked like the little boy who used to have nightmares and crawl into bed with Martha and me. Fine, he muttered. Maybe some space would be good. He moved toward the living room, then stopped and turned back to us. But, Dad, this conversation isn't over. We need to find a solution. We will, I promised, though I wasn't sure what that solution might look like. Lance nodded curtly and headed for the stairs. His footsteps were heavy on each step, and when he reached the second floor, his bedroom door slammed with enough force to rattle the picture frames in the hallway. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sudden quiet that had settled over the house. The rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the kitchen the dishwasher hummed to life. Go on up, Lucinda said softly, already moving to clear the dining table. I'll take care of this. You don't have to. I need to keep my hands busy, she interrupted, stacking plates with mechanical precision. It helps me think. I watched her for a moment, this young woman who'd married into our complicated family and was now dealing with consequences she'd never signed up for. The lasagna sat mostly untouched, cold and congealed on the serving dish. What should have been a celebration dinner had turned into something else entirely. Thank you, I said finally, for intervening, for trying to keep us civilized. She paused in her clearing, holding a stack of plates against her chest. He's scared, Orval. More scared than I've ever seen him. I don't know what kind of trouble he's in, but it's eating him alive. The admission hung between us like a confession. Then she turned back to her tasks, and I headed slowly toward the stairs, my knees protesting each step upward. The hallway was dim, lit only by a small nightlight near the bathroom. Lance's door remained firmly closed, no light visible beneath it, but I could hear movement inside, pacing perhaps, or the restless sounds of someone who wouldn't be sleeping anytime soon. My hand found the doorknob to the guest room, cold metal against warm palm. Behind me, the house settled into evening rhythms. Lucinda's quiet movements downstairs, the whisper of rain, the distant hum of appliances. I sat heavily on the guest bed, feeling every one of my 65 years settle into my bones like sediment in still water. Through the window, Seattle's evening stretched out in shades of gray and gold, streetlights beginning to flicker on as the rain painted everything in watercolor streaks. My wallet felt heavier than usual as I pulled it from my back pocket. Behind my driver's license and credit cards, Martha's photograph smiled back at me, the same picture I'd carried for 12 years since the cancer took her. She was laughing at something I'd said just before the shutter clicked, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that had made our 30-year marriage feel like a privilege rather than a commitment. What would you do, honey? I whispered to the photograph. How do we help him without enabling him? The silence gave me no answers, but Martha's face reminded me of better times. Lance at 7, losing his first tooth and demanding the tooth fairy leave him a silver dollar instead of quarters. Lance at 16, nervous about asking Sarah Mitchell to the prom, practicing his speech in our kitchen mirror. Lance at 22, graduating college with a business degree and dreams of starting his own company. Somewhere between those dreams and tonight's desperate demands, something had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. From downstairs came the gentle clink of dishes being washed, Lucinda working through her own shock and confusion in the only way she knew how, keeping busy, maintaining order in a world that suddenly felt chaotic and dangerous. I could hear Lance moving around in his bedroom, footsteps across the floor, a drawer sliding open and shut, the creak of bed springs. No rest for him tonight either. $200,000. It was more money than most people saw in their lifetimes. But to Lance, it was nothing. Scraps, he'd called it. The casual way he'd dismissed that amount told me more about his situation than his desperate pleas had. This wasn't credit card debt or a failed business venture. This was something darker, more dangerous, but giving him everything he wanted would destroy me financially. At 65, I had no time to rebuild from nothing. The business, the house, my retirement savings, they represented 4 decades of careful planning and hard work. Without them, I'd be just another old man dependent on Social Security and the kindness of strangers. Yet he was still my son, still the boy who'd crawled into my lap when thunderstorms scared him, who'd asked me to teach him how to change oil and balance a checkbook. The boy Martha and I had raised to be better than this. Maybe 300,000 would be enough. It would hurt, require me to leverage the business and dip deeply into retirement funds. But I could survive it, still have something left to live on, still maintain some independence. The rain intensified against the window, and I realized I was thinking like a businessman again, calculating risks, weighing options, looking for compromises that might satisfy everyone involved. It's how I'd approached every major decision since Martha died. Practical, methodical, safe. But this wasn't a business transaction. This was my son's life, possibly hanging in the balance. Through the floor I could hear Lucinda's voice, soft and concerned. Then Lance's deeper tones, too muffled to make out words, but carrying the unmistakable cadence of persuasion. He wasn't sleeping either. He was downstairs, probably trying to convince his wife to help him convince me. I tucked Martha's photograph back into my wallet, decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter pond. 300,000, final offer, enough to show I loved him, not enough to destroy everything his mother and I had built together. The thirst hit me like a reminder of my mortality. Dry mouth, scratchy throat, the kind of dehydration that comes from emotional exhaustion. I pushed myself up from the guest bed, joints protesting after an hour of sitting and thinking. The house had settled into evening quiet. Lucinda's movements long since ceased from downstairs. My bare feet found the hardwood hallway floor, cool against my skin. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended slowly, one hand trailing along the banister for balance. At my age, nighttime navigation required more caution than pride wanted to admit. The kitchen felt different in near darkness. I flicked on the small light above the sink, casting a warm glow across the granite countertops that Lucinda kept spotless. The tap water ran cold against my fingers as I filled the glass, the simple act somehow soothing after the day's emotional storms. "Dad?" I turned, water glass halfway to my lips. Lance emerged from the living room shadows like a ghost, his silhouette backlit by the faint glow of streetlights through the front windows. He moved slowly, cautiously, his head hanging in what looked like genuine shame. "Son, what are you doing up?" "Couldn't sleep." He stepped into the kitchen's circle of light, and I saw something different in his face. The desperate anger from dinner had been replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "Keep thinking about tonight, about what I said." I set my glass on the counter, studying his expression. This was the Lance I remembered from childhood, the boy who would sneak downstairs after bedtime to confess some small transgression, seeking forgiveness before sleep. "Dad, I'm sorry." His voice cracked slightly. "I was cruel earlier, said things I didn't mean, blamed you for things that weren't your fault." The apology hit me harder than his anger had. "We both said things." "No, listen." He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You're my father. You've given me everything, and when you needed respect in return, I gave you demands and accusations. Martha's photograph seemed to whisper approval from my wallet upstairs. This was what she would have wanted, her son recognizing his mistakes, seeking to make things right. I accept your apology, I said quietly. Would you? He hesitated, then looked up with hopeful eyes. Would you come out with me? Maybe grab a beer somewhere, talk like normal people instead of fighting like children? The invitation surprised me. It's getting late? Please, Dad. I know a quiet place nearby. The Foggy Lantern. Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood pub where we can sit and talk properly. Like friends. Friends. When was the last time Lance and I had been friends instead of father and son locked in generational conflict? Maybe Martha had been right about giving people second chances, about believing in the possibility of change. All right, I heard myself saying. That sounds good, son. His smile transformed his face completely, erasing years of tension and replacing them with something approaching joy. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me in an embrace that felt both surprising and natural. Thank you, he whispered against my shoulder. This means everything to me. I hugged him back, feeling the solid weight of my adult son in my arms. For the first time all day, hope flickered in my chest. Maybe we could work through this together. Maybe the $300,000 I'd decided to offer would be enough to start rebuilding our relationship along with his life. Let me get my jacket, I said as we separated. Mine too. It's cooling off outside. Lance was already moving toward the front closet, his step lighter than it had been all evening. The Foggy Lantern has great beer on tap, and they usually have a game on. Remember when we used to watch baseball together when you were teaching me about batting averages? Of course I remember. The memory warmed me more than the kitchen's overhead light. You kept stats in that little notebook. Still got it somewhere. He handed me my jacket, then shrugged into his own. Ready to go make some new memories? I nodded, following him toward the front door. Behind us, the kitchen light created a warm rectangle on the floor, but I was already looking forward, toward whatever waited at this neighborhood pub, toward the conversation that might finally heal the wounds between us. The Foggy Lantern lived up to its name. Amber light filtered through decades of cigarette smoke that had stained the wood paneling a rich brown, and the neon beer signs cast colored shadows across worn leather booths. It felt like the kind of place where neighborhood regulars nursed the same beer for hours while arguing about sports statistics. Lance led me to the bar counter where a stocky man with graying temples was polishing glasses with practiced efficiency. His name tag read Marvin, and he had the bearing of someone who'd seen enough of life to remain unimpressed by most of it. Evening, Marvin, Lance said with casual familiarity. 2 drafts, whatever you recommend. Marvin nodded without comment, pulling 2 perfect pints of amber ale. His movements were economical, professional, but I caught him studying Lance with the subtle attention bartenders develop for reading customers. Thanks, I said, as he set the glasses in front of us. The beer was cold with a clean bite that cut through the day's accumulated stress. Above us, a baseball game played on the mounted television. The Mariners were down by 3 in the 7th inning, and the small crowd of patrons offered occasional commentary to the screen. It felt comfortable, normal, like countless father-son evenings should have been. Remember when we used to watch games together? I asked, settling onto my bar stool. You were maybe 12, kept asking me to explain the infield fly rule. Lance's smile was genuine, reaching his eyes for the first time all day. Of course, Dad. You taught me to love baseball, said it was about patience, strategy, waiting for your pitch. Still good advice. For baseball and life, he agreed, raising his glass. To second chances. I clinked my beer against his, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight since dinner. Maybe this was what we'd needed all along, neutral territory away from family expectations and old grievances. The beer went down easy, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since arriving in Seattle. Lance seemed different here, more like the son I remembered, less like the desperate stranger who demanded my life savings. He asked about the shop, laughed at my stories about difficult customers, shared memories of helping me organize inventory during summer breaks. I miss this, I admitted as Marvin refilled our glasses without being asked. Me too. Lance took a long pull of beer, then glanced toward the entrance. Really missed it. Behind the bar, Marvin continued his quiet work, but I noticed him watching Lance with increasing frequency, professional interest, maybe, or the natural wariness bartenders develop toward customers who seem nervous, despite friendly conversation. Because Lance was nervous. Now that I was looking for it, I could see the subtle signs. Fingers tapping against his beer glass, quick glances toward the door, the way he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't watching. "Everything all right, son?" "Perfect." His response came too quickly, too bright. "Just enjoying the evening, you know? Sometimes you forget how good it feels to just sit and talk." The baseball game ended with the Mariners stranding 2 runners, and Marvin reached for the remote to find another channel. The movement seemed to make Lance more anxious, his eyes tracking every person who entered or left the pub. "Dad, would you excuse me for a minute?" Lance stood abruptly, fishing his phone from his pocket. "Need to use the restroom, maybe make a quick call." "Sure thing." I watched him navigate between tables toward the back of the pub, beer glass still half full on the bar counter. Something felt off about his sudden departure, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Maybe he was just checking on Lucinda, making sure she wasn't worried about our late-night excursion. Marvin appeared in front of me, wiping down the already clean bar surface with methodical strokes. "Nice evening for it," he said conversationally. "For what?" "Father-son time. Don't see much of that anymore." His eyes flicked toward the back of the pub where Lance had disappeared. "Your boy seems restless tonight." Before I could respond, something in Marvin's expression shifted. His casual demeanor sharpened into something more focused, more urgent. He leaned slightly across the bar, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Listen, old-timer," he said, his words carrying the weight of serious concern. "We need to talk." Marvin's hand clamped around my forearm with surprising strength, his grip urgent but not painful. The easy bartender facade had completely disappeared, replaced by something harder, more military in its intensity. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your son was in here earlier today with 3 men. I overheard them talking about your elimination." The word hit me like ice water. "What? That's impossible." "Look for yourself." Marvin's free hand reached under the bar counter, revealing a small security monitor built into the bar's surface. The screen showed multiple camera angles of the pub's interior and exterior, including a clear view of the entrance area. "There," he pointed to the main camera feed, showing the pub's front entrance. "Right now." My blood turned to lead. On the grainy but clear security footage, Lance stood just outside the entrance in animated conversation with 3 men who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime movie. One was tall and lean with the predatory stillness of a former cop. Another built like a linebacker with hands that could crush concrete. And the third had the quiet menace of someone who enjoyed his work too much. As I watched in horror, Lance reached into his jacket and handed an envelope to the tallest man. Money, payment. The transaction was brief, professional, and absolutely damning. "Those are Jake Reed, Rico Sanchez, and Tony Vespa," Marvin continued, his voice steady despite the urgency. "Local muscle for hire. They handle debt collection, intimidation, and worse. Much worse." "This can't be happening." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hollow and disbelieving. "I'm afraid it is." Marvin's expression held genuine sympathy. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, ran this place clean for 20 years. I know killers when I see them, and I know a setup when I witness one." On the screen, Lance was pointing toward the pub's interior, clearly giving instructions. The 3 men nodded, checked their watches, and began moving with purposeful coordination. One headed toward what looked like a side entrance, another toward the back alley, while the leader remained near the front door. "They're positioning themselves," Marvin explained, reading the situation with military precision, "creating a perimeter. Whatever your son told them, they're treating this like an operation." The pub's comfortable atmosphere suddenly felt suffocating. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every patron might be part of the plan. The baseball commentary continued on the television, oblivious to the fact that someone in this room was marked for death. "I can't believe Lance would—" But even as I said it, pieces were falling into place. The desperate demands for money, the the calculated manipulation, the fake reconciliation that had brought me here. All of it had been leading to this moment. "Believe it," Marvin said grimly. "I heard them planning earlier. Your son owes serious money to serious people, and he's decided your life insurance is easier than your savings account." My hands trembled as I gripped the bar counter, trying to process this impossible reality. The son I'd raised, taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, carried to bed when he fell asleep watching television, that same boy was outside coordinating my murder. "What do I do?" The question came out as a whisper. Marvin's answer was immediate and certain. "You get out, now, through the back exit while they're still getting into position." He reached under the counter again, this time pulling out what looked like a small knife. "Take this, and whatever happens, don't go home tonight. Find somewhere public, somewhere safe." On the security monitor, Lance was shaking hands with Jake Reed, sealing some kind of agreement. Then he turned back toward the pub's entrance, ready to return to his role as loving son while professional killers prepared to make him an orphan. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, pocketing the knife with nerveless fingers. "Because 27 years ago, someone's father saved my life in a firefight outside Kandahar." Marvin's eyes never left the security screen. "And because some things are just right or wrong, no matter what family politics are involved." Through the pub's dim interior, I could see Lance making his way back from the restroom area, phone still in his hand, probably confirming timing with his hired killers. His face wore the same loving expression he'd shown me all evening, but now I could see it for what it really was, the mask of a son planning patricide. "Thank you," I whispered to Marvin, my voice barely audible above the pub's background noise. He nodded once, a soldier's acknowledgement, then turned back to polishing glasses as if nothing had happened. I stood slowly from my bar stool, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to run. Running would draw attention. Running would get me killed. Instead, I walked with measured steps toward the back of the pub, past the pool table where two college students argued about a missed shot, past the corner booth where an elderly couple shared nachos and reminisced about their dating years. The men's room door felt heavier than it should have as I pushed it open. My hands were shaking now, adrenaline flooding my system like it hadn't since Korea, 60 years ago when bullets sang overhead, and survival meant making split-second decisions with incomplete information. I locked the door behind me, the metallic click echoing in the small tiled space. The bathroom was cramped, barely 6 feet wide, with a single window set high on the back wall. Frosted glass, rectangular, maybe 2 feet wide by 18 inches tall. Not much room for a 65-year-old man with arthritic joints and a bad knee from decades of crawling under car hoods. But it was the only way out that didn't lead past 3 professional killers. The window opened with a rusty protest, cool Seattle air rushing in to mix with the bathroom's industrial disinfectant smell. I grabbed the edge of the sink and pulled myself up, my knee screaming in protest. The porcelain was slick under my palms, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I might fall backward onto the tile floor. 65 years old, when had I become this fragile? The window frame bit into my ribs as I squeezed through, my jacket catching on the metal latch. Below me, the alley stretched away into darkness, punctuated by a single security light mounted on the building across the narrow space. Dumpsters lined both walls like sleeping monsters, and the pavement looked very far away. I had no choice. I pushed through the window opening, felt myself falling, and hit the alley pavement harder than I'd hoped. My knees buckled, pain shooting up through my spine, but I rolled with the impact the way Sergeant Martinez had taught us during basic training. Some muscle memory never dies. The alley smelled of garbage and rain with an undertone of something else. Grease from the pub's kitchen, maybe, or oil from the delivery trucks that serviced these back entrances. I stayed low, moving along the building's wall toward the front, my breathing more ragged than I wanted to admit. Through the brick and mortar, I could hear the faint sounds of the pub continuing its normal Friday night rhythm. Baseball commentary, laughter, the clink of glasses. Somewhere in that warmth and normalcy, my son was probably checking his watch, wondering why his father was taking so long in the bathroom. My son who had hired killers to murder me. The thought should have paralyzed me, but instead it sharpened my focus. I reached the corner of the building and pressed my back against the brick wall, listening. Male voices carried on the night air, not from inside the pub, but from somewhere near the front entrance. Lance's voice, and others. I edged closer to the corner, staying in the shadows cast by an overhang that sheltered the pub's rear delivery entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my breathing was controlled now, measured. The old training was coming back, muscle memory from a war I'd tried to forget. From around the corner came the low murmur of conversation, too distant to make out words, but close enough to recognize the cadence. Planning, coordination, the sound of professionals discussing their work. I had to know what they were saying, had to understand exactly what I was up against if I was going to survive the next 24 hours. The knife Marvin had given me felt solid in my jacket pocket, but I had no illusions about my chances in a fair fight against 3 younger, stronger men. This wasn't going to be a fair fight. Moving carefully, I crept toward the front of the building, using parked cars as cover. A Ford pickup truck sat at the curb directly across from the pub's main entrance, its bulk providing perfect concealment. I crouched behind its rear bumper and peered around the tailgate. Under the amber glow of a streetlight, Lance stood with 3 men who looked exactly like what they were. Professional violence wrapped in casual clothes. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across their faces, turning the conversation into a scene from a crime movie. I crouched behind the pickup truck's tailgate, close enough to hear every word, far enough away to remain invisible in the truck's shadow. "Tomorrow at 8, the tall one was saying, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of giving orders others didn't question. This had to be Jake Reed, the ex-cop Marvin had identified. Make it look like an accident. Brake failure, steering problem, something mechanical. Lance nodded eagerly, like a student receiving instructions from a beloved teacher. He always parks in the same spot behind his shop. Creature of habit, you know? Been using that space for 20 years. What kind of car? The stocky one, Rico Sanchez, had a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. Matters for the setup. Old Ford pickup, probably 10 years old. He maintains it himself, changes his own oil, all that stubborn independent stuff. Lance's casual dismissal of his father's self-reliance made my stomach turn. Blue, 4-door extended cab. The third man, Tony Vespa, spoke quietly, his words barely carrying across the street. Security cameras in that area? A few, but nothing that covers the parking area directly. The angle's wrong from the street cameras, and the shop's system focuses on the front entrance, not the employee lot. They'd thought of everything. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a methodical assassination planned with professional precision. I memorized every word, every detail, storing it all for whatever came next. $200,000 is cheap for this kind of work, Rico complained, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Usually we get $500,000 for a clean elimination. Lance's voice tightened. That's all I have right now in cash. But once the inheritance comes through, he spread his hands in a gesture that promised future riches. We're talking about over $1 million in total assets. I'll double your fee once everything's settled. And if the old man changed his will? Jake's question was pointed, professional. If he left everything to charity or some girlfriend we don't know about? He didn't. I've seen the will. He had me witness it 3 years ago when Mom died. Everything comes to me, then to Lucinda, if something happens to me. Lance's confidence was absolute, chilling. He's too sentimental to cut out his only son. Too sentimental? That's what 40 years of loving someone unconditionally got you. A reputation for being too sentimental to protect yourself from their betrayal. Tony was studying the pub's entrance. What about the wife? She going to be a problem afterward? Lucinda? Lance actually laughed. She barely balances the checkbook. Won't ask questions about insurance money or inheritance details. And if she does, he shrugged with casual cruelty, she's not really a problem we can't handle. The threat against my daughter-in-law crystallized something cold and hard in my chest. These weren't just killers. They were predators who viewed innocent people as obstacles to be eliminated. Lucinda, who made lasagna and tried to keep peace in her family, who had no idea she'd married a monster. 7 o'clock tomorrow, Jake was saying, pulling an envelope from Lance's outstretched hand. We meet at the usual spot, confirm the target's location, then move into position. Clean, simple, no complications. What about afterward? Rico asked. Body disposal. Leave him in the truck. Make it look like he had a heart attack or stroke after the accident. Old guy works too hard, high stress. Happens all the time. Paramedics won't look too closely at a 70-year-old's heart giving out. 65, not 70. But I suppose to them all, old men look the same. The envelope changed hands with the practiced efficiency of a business transaction. Blood money, paid in advance for services to be rendered. I watched my son shake hands with his father's executioner, sealing a contract written in family betrayal. Pleasure doing business, Jake said, tucking the envelope inside his jacket. Tomorrow night, your problems disappear. Lance's smile in the streetlight was radiant, genuinely happy for the first time all day. Thank you. This means everything to me. They began moving apart, the meeting clearly over. Rico and Tony walked toward a dark sedan parked down the block, while Jake headed in the opposite direction toward what looked like a motorcycle. Lance stood for a moment under the streetlight, checking his phone, then turned back toward the pub's entrance. He was going back inside. Going to return to the bar, order another beer, and wait for his father to come back from a bathroom visit? That would never happen. I had maybe 5 minutes before he started to worry. Maybe 10 before he asked Marvin if anyone had seen the old man leave. Maybe 15 before he realized something had gone wrong with his perfectly planned evening of father-son bonding before patricide. Time was running out. I had to get to my car before Lance realized I was gone, before he started asking Marvin questions, before this entire night collapsed into chaos that would leave me exposed and vulnerable. I moved quickly but quietly across the street, staying in the shadows between streetlights. My Ford sat exactly where we'd left it, keys still in my jacket pocket, where Lance couldn't have touched them during our brief time in the pub. Small mercy. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine with a prayer that it wouldn't backfire or stall, and pulled away from the curb with the careful slowness of someone trying not to draw attention. The drive back to Lance's house took exactly 14 minutes through Seattle's late-night streets. 14 minutes to process what I'd witnessed, to accept the reality that my only son had arranged my murder, to begin calculating what came next. The logical part of my mind was already working through practical considerations, how much time I had, what resources were available, which innocent people needed protection. Lucinda. Whatever happened between Lance and me, she didn't deserve to become collateral damage in a war she didn't even know was being fought. I parked 3 houses down from Lance's townhouse, the same careful distance I'd learned during night reconnaissance operations in Korea. The street was quiet, windows dark, normal people sleeping through what felt like the most important night of my life. I walked quickly but quietly to the front door, using the house key Lance had given me with such apparent trust just hours earlier. The lock turned smoothly, the door opening into the darkened living room where this evening's catastrophe had begun. I stood for a moment, listening. Somewhere upstairs, Lucinda was sleeping, probably exhausted from the emotional turmoil of our dinner argument. She had no idea her husband was currently sitting in a pub, wondering why his father was taking so long in the bathroom. The guest room felt different now, not welcoming, but like enemy territory I needed to escape. I packed methodically, the way Martha had taught me during our early years of marriage when my night shifts at the shop meant coming home at strange hours. Every item had its place, every movement calculated to avoid noise that might wake the house. My blood pressure medication went into the toiletry kit, clean shirt and underwear folded into the suitcase. The photograph of Martha, still carrying her warmth and wisdom, tucked safely into my wallet. Everything that mattered, everything that made this place temporarily home, erased as if I'd never been here. Before leaving, I took a piece of paper from the guest room's small desk and wrote carefully in my most legible handwriting. Lucy, your husband is in danger. If you love him, take the children and go to your mother's house tomorrow morning. Don't ask questions. Just leave. Trust me. Oh, it wasn't the whole truth, but it was enough truth to save her life. I placed the note on the kitchen counter where she'd find it when she made her morning coffee, weighted down with the salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away if someone opened a window. Then I was back in my Ford, backing carefully out of their neighborhood, leaving behind the son I'd raised and the daughter-in-law I'd grown to love. The highway stretched ahead, dark ribbon leading home to Portland, to safety, to whatever came after tonight. I-5 South was nearly empty at this hour, just long-haul truckers and the occasional late-night traveler making the run between Seattle and Portland. Good driving conditions, clear weather, 3 hours to think through everything I'd learned and decide what to do with it. My phone started ringing when I was 20 minutes outside Seattle city limits. Lance's number on the display, probably calling from the pub's parking lot, after Marvin told him nobody had seen the old man leave. I let it ring. It rang again 5 minutes later. Again 10 minutes after that. By the time I crossed into Oregon, the missed call counter had reached double digits. By the time I saw the Portland city limits sign, it had reached 37 missed calls. 47 missed calls by the time I pulled into my own driveway. 47 desperate attempts to reach his father, to explain away tonight's disappearance, to get back on schedule for tomorrow evening's 8 o'clock appointment with murder. Lance was panicking now, realizing his carefully laid plans had somehow gone wrong, that his target had vanished into the Seattle night without explanation. I turned off the phone and dropped it into my jacket pocket. Tomorrow I would need to decide what to do with everything I'd learned tonight. How to protect myself, how to save Lucinda, how to stop 3 professional killers from collecting their blood money. Tonight, I was just a 65-year-old man who'd discovered his son wanted him dead, and I was tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix. But I was alive, and now I knew exactly what I was fighting against. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.